Hello and welcome. Today, we're jumping into one of the most talked about, most controversial economic tools out there, the minimum wage. On the surface, it seems so simple, but believe me, the reality is anything but.
Let's just start with a really basic question. Think about it for a second. What is an hour of your work truly worth? It's a personal question for sure, but for hundreds of millions of people all over the world, it's not some philosophical debate.
For them, the answer is actually decided by law. Yep, a legally required wage floor that says this is the absolute lowest amount anyone can pay you. It's a policy that's all about ensuring a basic level of fairness.
And that, right there, is the central conflict we're going to explore. On the one hand, the minimum wage is seen as this really straightforward tool for justice. But when you start to look under the hood, it becomes one of the trickiest economic puzzles for policymakers to figure out.
Okay, so let's get into it. To really understand this puzzle, we kind of have to go back to the beginning. Where did this whole idea even come from? Let's take a look at how this policy went global.
So this idea of the government setting a wage floor, it's not new at all. It actually kicked off in New Zealand way back in 1894 to fight labor exploitation. The UK got on board in 1909, targeting some really low-paying industries. But the idea got a huge boost in 1938 when the US set up a federal minimum wage right in the middle of the Great Depression. After that, the model started spreading to developing nations like India in 48, and it's still being rolled out today, like with Malaysia in 2013.
But here's where things get really tricky. A policy that was born in these industrialized countries doesn't always translate perfectly to developing economies. And the biggest reason why? Well, you've got a single wage trying to cover economies that are worlds apart. Think of it like this. In a lot of these economies, you don't just have one labor market. You really have two. First, there's the formal sector, registered companies, official contracts, taxes, the whole deal. But then you have this massive informal sector. We're talking street vendors, domestic workers, little unregistered businesses. The minimum wage law? It usually only covers that first group, leaving millions and millions of people completely outside its protection.
Now, what's really striking about this slide is just the sheer range you're seeing. Look at that. The projected monthly minimum wage for 2025 in Malaysia is over $360. Meanwhile, in India and Bangladesh, it's less than 100. This huge difference shows you exactly why a one-size-fits-all approach is so tough, not just between countries, but often inside them too.
And this quote just nails the problem. When wage increases only happen for people in the formal sector, it can actually make the divide even bigger. It ends up limiting how much the policy can really help the most vulnerable people who are stuck in that informal economy.
So, faced with all this complexity, policymakers haven't just thrown up their hands. Instead, they've come up with a whole menu of different options. Let's take a quick look at the different kinds of tools they're working with.
There's a whole toolkit out there, right? A single national wage is easy and simple, but it totally ignores that the cost of living in a big city is way different than in a rural area. A regional model is more customized, but it can get really complex. Then you have multi-tier systems, which can target specific groups, like younger workers, but that just adds more red tape. And then there are some really innovative ideas.
You got to look at Singapore's progressive wage model. It's a fascinating approach. Instead of just one wage floor for everybody, they've created these wage ladders in specific industries, like cleaning and security. So if you want to earn more, you have to get more training and take on more skilled work. It's a really cool attempt to tie wages directly to productivity.
So why are there so many different models? Why is there so much passionate debate? Well, it's because at the end of the day, economists are working with two fundamentally different theories about how labor markets actually function.
Okay, first up is the classic competitive model. This is probably what you learned in Econ 101. It's all supply and demand. As you can see on the graph, when you artificially force the wage up from its natural sweet spot, that's from W0 to W1, employers want to hire fewer people. The result? A gap. More people want jobs than there are jobs available. In other words, unemployment. It's a clean, simple, and very powerful argument.
But what if the market isn't perfectly competitive? What if employers hold most of the power? Well, that brings us to this key concept, monopsony. Basically, this is when a few big employers can pretty much dictate wages, and because they have that power, they can pay workers less than they're really worth.
And this, right here, is the great divide. This is why the debate gets so heated. The classic competitive model says a minimum wage hike kills jobs. But the monopsony model, it says that a reasonable wage hike can actually fix the market, pushing up both wages and employment. The predicted outcomes are completely opposite. So, which model is right? You know, the research we're looking at today argues that maybe, just maybe, that's the wrong question. What if, instead of choosing one theory over the other, we actually integrated them?
The solution on the table is this hybrid framework. Step 1, figure out what kind of market you're dealing with. Is it super competitive, or do a few employers have all the power? Step 2, for those competitive sectors, you carefully tie any wage increases to productivity. Step 3, in those monopsony-style markets, you use a strong wage floor to balance the scales. And, this is crucial, step 4, you create totally separate policies, like training programs and social safety nets, to help people in that huge informal economy.
So the bottom line is this. It's all about using the right tool for the right job. Instead of one big, clumsy sledgehammer, it's about using a set of surgical tools that are adapted to what's really happening on the ground.
So why does all this academic theory matter in the real world? It's because getting this policy right has a direct, massive impact on people's ability to earn a decent living, and honestly, on the health of the entire economy.
All right, so let's quickly recap the biggest takeaways. First, a simple one-size-fits-all minimum wage just doesn't cut it in economies that are split between formal and informal sectors. Second, there's a whole menu of different options out there. Third, the best approach totally depends on what that specific labor market looks like. And finally, you can't just set a wage and walk away. It has to be part of a much bigger strategy that supports everybody.
And all of this leaves us with one last big thought. The whole idea of a minimum wage was born in the industrial age, an era of factories and clear jobs. So what's the right model for our 21st century economy of gig work, digital platforms, and totally new forms of employment? That's the billion-dollar question we all need to start figuring out. Thanks for joining me.